Welcome, everyone. I am Sciortino. I am the director of Junction, Southeast Asia Junction, and we are based here on the 4th floor. It's a public venue which tries to promote knowledge and interaction on Southeast Asia, all the aspects of Southeast Asia. We are quite ambitious in our mandate to try to expose both the complexity as well as the richness of this region. Today, I am very glad to see so many people for a topic that is a symbol of the environmental degradation of this region. So the Mekong is not the only river that is under attack, but we, being the biggest river of this region, and considering how many dams are being built on the mighty Mekong, of course, deserve particular attention. It is also a source of electricity, and for this, of course, there is a lot of economic interest going around considering the use of these natural resources. Today, we have 4 speakers that will illustrate some of the topics that have been, and you will see in this beautiful photograph from 4 countries, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. This was an open project that Junction started during the COVID time. We couldn't do events, so we decided to try something new, and we asked people to send out stories, photo story or art stories. Upstairs, we have 6 panels which are more of paintings, of someone sent paintings of the Mekong. This is upstairs on the 4th floor. But here are all the photographic essays. So you can find the complete essays on our website. We also tried another one which is more about experience of COVID, and hopefully we will have an exhibition in the future. So these are stories that people themselves send to us voluntarily. Some of them are professional photographers like Samyan, who is sitting here, please stand by. He is the photographer who did this beautiful black and white photograph, and is also our partner at Blanco Tribune. We collaborate with them and with the environmental networks for this exhibition. So thank you very much, Samyan. But some of them are activists, like you will see there. This is Butterfly. This is an activist organization in Thailand. So we have varied photographs of professional and not, and they all tell the story of the Mekong. In addition to the photograph, we have here 4 resource persons that will give their own story of the Mekong. We will start with Middleton. I don't think he needs much introduction because he's Mr. Dance or Mr. Mekong. He writes, he talks, he teaches about environmental issue in the Greater Mekong region and Southeast Asia more general, with a particular focus on the Mekong. So he will be the first speaker tonight. Then we will have Anthony Zola. Again, I don't think he needs much introduction, but he's an independent researcher. He has worked in Thailand and Laos for decades, and is very much interested in risk, in this case of dam construction, especially impacts on the people, on the community in the Mekong. Then we have Premrudee again. She has worked with Daoroung for many years, a network working on environmental issue, and now she is with the Laure Dam Investment Monitor, extremely important because it tells us the money beyond dam construction. And finally, Laure Siegel, again a freelance journalist, who will be talking to us about the role of the media and other issue related to journalism and environmental degradation. So thank you to all the speakers for being with us today, and we will start immediately. Each one of them will talk for about 12 to 15 minutes maximum, and then so to have enough time for question and answer after their presentation. So please stay until the end, because it will get even more exciting as we can have a dialogue on this issue, and then of course officially launch this exhibition. So please, let's start with Carl.
Thank you very much, Leah, for the kind introduction and for inviting me here today. When I thought about the title of this exhibition, it made me wonder, how did we get to the point that an exhibition like this was needed? The Mekong is blue and dry. And I think when I walked around the room looking at the photographs, it shows how much and how quickly the river has changed in a relatively short period of time. So Leah asked me to kind of try and give a bigger picture, which I can try and do. Probably the first thing that always strikes me is that the changes that have happened most recently have really only, the dam construction has only really started since the 1990s in terms of the very large projects that have been constructed. So the rate of change of the Mekong is quick. It's within, I would guess, everyone's lifetime within this room for sure. So I think what we're discussing is something very recent, both in terms of the change that have happened and in terms of what needs to be done urgently now. I think if you want the biggest picture, on the main screen there are 12 projects now operating in China, and then more recently, since the late 2000s, another 2 on the Mekong mainstream in the lower areas, so the Zaiburi Dam in northern Laos and the Donsahong in southern Laos. But then there's also many medium and large-scale projects on the tributaries in Laos, mainly for hydropower. Then there are some of the projects in northeast Thailand that have been built earlier that tend to be a bit smaller but still fragment the ecosystems. So it's often said that the Mekong is one of the most biodiverse rivers in the world. Some people have measured it as the second most biodiverse after the Amazon. So it shows that this is a globally important river in that sense. Although now with the projects that are being built, the impacts on the ecosystems are becoming more visible. So I think these numbers will have to be revisited. In terms of the title, the Mekong is blue and dry, well, I mean, this is reflecting what's happened just in the last couple of years. And it takes place in the context of a drought over the last 3 years that is the worst that has been in living memory. But then this has resulted in low river flows across the basin that intersects with now the very large and extensive construction of dams across the basin. So really the questions that have been being debated by researchers, by government, by the media is, why is this happening? Is it climate change? Is it drought? Is it El Nino? Is it the hydropower projects? And probably it's a combination of all three. But the relative weighting to each is something that really needs to be clarified. So for me, this is the broadest picture of the challenges that happen in the region. I think the next thing to then comment, I know that Pete Ing is going to talk more about the organizations, so I'm not going to touch much on this. But I want to just very briefly comment that the lack of clarity about why there is drought, why there is Blue River, why there is algal growth, is partly the shortcomings of the regional governance of the river and the organizations that are not able to share enough information and make clear enough what is happening in the region. So again, Pete will discuss more about the organizations. I wanted to just comment on 2 things that I thought were important as a framing discussion around this. I think one of the key things is that the data sharing in the region over the last couple of years, and especially since late 2020, has started to increase. So after a very intense debate about the drought in 2019-2020, in late 2020, China announced that it would share more data with the downstream countries. And I think this made headlines in the sense that China might be cooperating more with the downstream countries. But I want to kind of ask a few more questions of that. On the one hand, I think it's more sharing of hydrological and some water quality data is a step in the right direction. But the question more is it enough of a step? And I think there's still quite a bit to go further to really say that there's a proper cooperation. One thing I think is that the amount of data being shared is still quite limited. It's only the lower river monitoring stations on the land channel that is shared with the downstream. But I think also more as important is what's being shared. And mainly it's scientific data, which is important, but it's not directly connecting to the impacts that are being experienced downstream. And so in my mind, I think that water data sharing isn't the end point, it's actually the starting point of something far more important, which is accountable water governance, especially across borders. So, although it's to be lauded that there's more data sharing, I think the question becomes what next? There's also a new initiative that is coming from a US organization called the Mekong Dam Monitor that is using satellite information to monitor the rise and fall of reservoir levels. And I think this is also interesting because it is making more transparent how projects are being operated to a degree when that information is otherwise not in the public domain. But this in itself has also created a number of challenges because, as you would be aware from reading the newspapers, there's very intense geopolitics between the US and China that are increasingly playing out within mainland Southeast Asia now, both over the South China Sea or East Vietnam Sea and over the Mekong River. So I think the challenge there is that maybe more information is coming into the public domain about what's happening, but it's also becoming very politicized, and maybe to a degree that's necessary. Politicization can make things happen, but it can also lead to a contestation without cooperation and resolution. So I think the thing I want to convey here is that there needs to be far more focus now on accountability of projects that are being operated to the consequences that are happening for people's lives on the river, rather than just celebrating data sharing alone. And I think this also relates to the future of the Mekong as well, in the sense that how is the Mekong to be managed? Because many of the projects now are changing the ecosystems, the hydrology, and have consequences for downstream people's lives, as well as upstream, because fish flow downstream, of course. So, in the most recent Mekong River Commission strategic plan, it kind of hints of a new way of thinking about governing the river, or managing the river, which is more about thinking about the infrastructure is in place, how will the infrastructure be managed for the Mekong's future. And there are different scenarios, I think. One is Mekong is an economic resource to generate electricity and maximize the economic yields. Another is to think more about returning the Mekong to as much of its natural state as possible, recovering ecosystems, and recognizing the wider set of values that the Mekong has provided to riverside communities. So I'm just touching on a few things here. I'm happy to discuss more on that. The third thing I want to point out, if there's still some time, is another challenge about data sharing. So most of the data sharing at the moment is very technical data, and it can inform technical decision making, it can inform modeling, but then does it accurately reflect people's lived experience of the river? So as the river has changed, so too have people's lives and cultures. Now, partly the region itself is in a process of very rapid change since the 1980s. As the region transitioned from a period of fighting to a relative period of peace, there was more rapid economic growth and many things started to change. So those things have happened in the context of the projects that have been built changing the river. But then also the projects themselves have disconnected people from their previous way of making a living, connected to the river. And also, very importantly, to the cultures that connected to the river as well. So I think these photographs partly are documenting the changes that could happen or the consequences of them. But then that also makes me think, well, data sharing at the moment is primarily state to state. But how do people's own voice get heard into decision-making processes that are primarily through these physical data sharing processes? And I think this is another very key thing that isn't really being addressed at the moment. So one part of that is, does it really help if you hear that the river is going to drop in the next day in terms of the quality of your life, the well-being of people that still depend on the river? Is it possible to use that information to really make a difference and be okay? Or is it just to anticipate that something bad is going to happen? But then the other side, so one thing is whether the information is useful to communities, but then there's the other side coming upwards as well, which is the question of how can the stories that are being represented here actually be heard into the types of processes that are supposed to be regional water governance and listened to and taken seriously? In other words, how can the impacts that are being documented actually be internalized and acknowledged and valued? And so partly I think the answer at the moment is through exhibitions like this, the work of the media and so on. But I think there has to also be a discussion about some form of institutionalization, some means by which these voices can be heard. So that's my final point, but there's kind of a last thing here that I think is also important, that most of the way that has been, that the Mekong is discussed in these discussions about water governance focuses mainly on water and livelihoods, water and economy. But as I said at the beginning, the Mekong is one of the world's most biodiverse rivers. It's rich with life, incredible life. And those voices really also need to be heard. They don't communicate in the same way that humans do. But it has to be recognized, the value not just of human life, but other forms of life as well, like humans' obligation to respect that. And so again, I think at least some of the exhibition photographs, I saw especially some at the back over there, are really conveying that richness of biodiversity and diversity of life that is very important, I think, to the future of the river, for people and other life as well. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. And Klaus, then we go directly to Anthony.
Thank you, Rosalia. Carl said something very important, that it's not only the dams in the Mekong that are making it turn blue and making it dry up, but it's also the fact that there are dams on the tributaries of the Mekong. And that's where I've been spending the last 13 years of my life, following up on the tributaries of the Mekong and working in social risk management or social safeguards. Basically, I'm a social safeguards auditor. And if you have a company, you know that you don't like auditors, you don't like when auditors come, you don't like to be audited by anybody. And so I'm not a very well-liked person when I show up at the hydropower projects that I am assigned to, and I end up auditing them from a social standpoint. Today I want to just present to you in sort of an introduction or an overview of the international framework on social risk management, or the international framework for social safeguards. As Carl pointed out, there are all sizes of dams that are being built. There's the small, mostly small-scale hydropower dams on the tributaries, and I'm focusing on the tributaries now. The small-scale ones, and on those there's a little resettlement from time to time, but usually none. And the investors in those small dams are the Lao companies themselves, Thai companies, Vietnamese companies, and some others. Then there's the medium-sized dams, and those usually they may have some relocation and may have some resettlement, and so those are dams where the Chinese, the Koreans, the Thais, and sometimes Laos, but there are other nationalities that are investing in those dams. An example of the medium-sized one is the Nam U Cascade, the Nam U that flows from northern Pong Salit, Laos, all the way down to the Mekong at BACC, just north of Luang Prabang. There are seven dams there, and there's a cascade. There's now a dam called the Hin Boon Downstream Dam, the Hue Ha, and also the Nam Khan in Luang Prabang. They also then have the large-scale dams, and those are mostly international investors from Japan, Norway, from the United States, France, Korea, Chinese, and Thai. And there are now 55 of these mega hydropower dams on the tributaries, some of which are operational, some of which are still under construction, and some of them are still in the planning stage. These include things like the Junction 2 Dam, the Tring Hin Boon expansion, the Nam Yip Dam, and the famous one, which is the Sipian Se Nam Noi Dam. And also on the mainstream, then you have the Sciortino Dam and the Dan Sahong Dam in the southern part of Laos. And then, of course, they have the ones that are still being planned and being constructed at different places up and down the Mekong. To monitor what happens to the people at these dams, there is an international framework of social safeguards, social and environmental safeguards. Probably the best set of safeguards is operated by the International Finance Corporation. It's part of the World Bank Group. And they have a whole, they are the private sector window to the World Bank. So they loan money out to the private sector to build dams. It's one of their favorite things to do, but they are trying to do it responsibly. And they include in their contracts with the private sector what they call their performance, the IFC performance standards, the International Finance Corporation performance standards. So they have 8 different performance standards. I would just say it this once because we don't have to say them all over again, but risk management, labor, meaning how the labor under each of these projects is treated, resource efficiency, community participation and disclosure of information to communities, land resettlement, biodiversity, indigenous people, and cultural heritage. I will only read those once because the other ones that I'm going to talk to usually draw upon these principles, these performance standards of the IFC. The next set actually is run by the Equator Principles. I don't know whether you know about the Equator Principles or not. The Equator Principles are a set of principles that banks all over the world voluntarily comply with. And the Equator Principles, there's a set of 10 different principles. I will not go through them because they're very similar to the IFC. But the Equator Principles also adopt, as part of the principles, the 8 IFC performance standards. All right? The Equator Principles they operate based upon a membership. So there's just over 100 different banks that are subscribed to voluntarily implement or to loan money to hydropower projects and other infrastructure projects based upon the Equator Principles. So those banks include what we call Equator banks, all right? Mostly European and Canadian banks. There's a few African, Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese, Australian, New Zealand, Middle Eastern, and South American banks. There are only 4 American banks, Bank of America, Citigroup, Ex-Im Bank, and Wells Fargo. But for those of us who live in ASEAN, there are no ASEAN banks that subscribe to the Equator Principles. None. So Indonesian banks, Malaysian banks, Thai banks, Brunei banks can invest, and they don't have to follow any principles at all if they don't want to. So that's a definite weakness. However, there are some, like some of the Thai banks, that are owned now by Japanese banks, British banks, that do subscribe to the Equator Principles. And so they require that the Thai banks now voluntarily follow the Equator Principles. Next is the Asian Development Bank, which has a safeguards policy that was set up in 2009. They have very strict requirements, and they force these requirements onto public and private, the public sector, meaning governments that borrow from the ADB, the private sector, which means that companies that borrow from the ADB out of their private sector window. And they have 3 sets of policies. Number 1 is environment. Number 2 is the involuntary resettlement policy, and number 3, an indigenous peoples policy. These policies set forth in elaborate detail, all right, the strict requirements for how you are to implement your project. And most of my work has been on projects like the Asian Development Bank funded projects, and where I am required to go out and basically follow up and make sure that these principles, these policies of the Asian Development Bank, the IFC performance standards, the Equator Principles are being implemented. After the World Bank, after the Asian Development Bank, you have the World Bank. They call it social risk management at the World Bank. They don't call it safeguards anymore. They've come up just recently with a new framework, 2018, 2019, a new environment and social framework. They have 10 different social standards that are required by the borrowers. They are very similar to the IFC standards that I mentioned earlier, so I'm not going to repeat them here. They also have directives for bank officers that bank officers are required to follow when they deal with their clients. They also have guidance notes for borrowers. So if, for example, the Thai government or the Lao government or the Cambodian government is going to borrow, they also have an actual booklet that they can hand out and say, you have to follow, if you're going to borrow our money, you have to follow our guidelines. And then they have different notes and formats and so forth that they help. And they do a lot of training with the governments as well. They also loan money to the private sector through the IFC. Now, those are the banks, the big banks, the ADB, IFC, World Bank, and so forth. You also have business organizations like the International Hydropower Association. Many companies, big construction companies that are building the Sciortino Dam, that are building the Luang Prabang Dam, that are building Daoroung Dam, and other dams are members of this International Hydropower Association, and they also have a set of requirements, a set of principles that you should follow if you're a member of the association. You also have in Thailand the Thai Bankers Association. All right, they have something which is called the Sustainable Banking Guidelines for Responsible Lending. All right, so if you're a Thai bank and you're a member of the TBA, the Thai Bankers Association, then you are obligated to follow that. Also, you have the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have a set of principles as well. Also, the United Nations has something called the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Those are all enforced by the United Nations Office on Human Rights. And there are a lot of companies and Thai banks and other sort of banks that are afraid of the United Nations Office on Human Rights because they do follow up. The Thai government has something called the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and that is implemented or enforced by the Securities Exchange Commission of Thailand. And so those are then, that is the international framework that you should know about, all right? And the documents that are here I have to read every night before I go to bed, otherwise I can't do my job the next day. And they're very difficult. And I just wanted to say a little bit more about the types of reports. Under these requirements, these policies, this framework, you have a whole lot of reports that have to be prepared. The environmental social impacts assessment, resettlement and ethnic development plan. You have the resettlement plans, resettlement framework, supplementary plans, annual implementation plans. All right, this is in addition to the initial environmental examination, the environmental impact assessment, and the environmental action plans and emergency evacuation plans. You also have things like cumulative impacts assessments, so that, for example, in Laos you have the Nam Lum Dam. You have 5 different dams in the Nam Lum. All right, and so there needs to be studies done on the impacts, cumulative impacts of each one of these dams. A lot of this is being done now. There are a small group of us working in Southeast Asia that have become specialists in this field. I am training as many Thai and as many Lao to replace me as possible because I'm an old man now, and I can move out of this field, but turn it over to younger people to do. All right, and they are motivated to do it. So I think I'd just like to leave it at that for the moment. That provides you with a general framework of what's going on in the field, that it's being audited every single day. There's someone out there auditing, all right? And I will just say one more thing, that I was asked to work on the Mekong mainstream dams, and I refused every time because the Mekong is a special river and it should not be dammed up. Thank you.
Okay, Clarence, I think we rarely hear this other side of the story, and later on we want to know what is happening with the audits that are so many audits, but what is the reality of that? Do they listen to the auditors? Maybe
We shut off the money. We shut off the money if they don't.
Maybe we can hear more in the discussion, and I am sure that Premrudee will tell us some more on this.
Good evening, everyone. I'll take my mask off. I hope it's all right for all of you, even though Bangkok is pretty dangerous now. I think the situation of the Mekong blue and dry, as Carl already mentioned, it's happened some time ago, right? It's not new anymore to all of us. It started back to end of 2019, pretty immediately after Sciortino Dam started the operation. So the so-called scientific evidence, the word they used, that Mekong became the sediment hunger river, because all the sediment were stuck there in the reservoir of the dam upstream. So the river became slow and it's changed the color, and then of course it's destroyed the river bank because it's trying to get more sediment along the way, the flow, right? And also the algae, the blue and algae happened in the river, so, and causing all the impact. So this is back to 2 years ago, and I want to skip the debate about if the Mekong Dam worsened the climate change situation or the climate change situation worsened the hydropower dam. I think I will skip that, and I'm going to jump into the conclusion that this is about the dam, and I'm not going to relate back to the climate change here in my talk. But I think, all in all, that the physical change of the Mekong and make the color change is just one part of the change of the whole situation in the Mekong, right? I mean, as a person who monitor and observe the situation in the region, I would like to talking mainly relate to the actor, which I think if we observe in the past 10 years, there are some change as well. Some key actor in the region, starting from the Mekong River Commission. I think some of you might know that back to 2010, MRC released one pretty big report called Strategic Environmental Assessment. Already said clearly that if the 12 dams along the Mekong mainstream that proposed back to that time and until now, 8 dams in the Laure area, 2 Laos Thai, another 2 in Cambodia. If it's complete, it will only give 7 to 11% more security to the, energy security to the Mekong, lower Mekong basin country, but yet it's going to destroy, very quickly to the large area, most of the Mekong, lower Mekong area, and the very hot spot. A very dangerous area is 2 places. The first one is in Cambodia, Tole Sap. Another one is Mekong Delta, right? And just 10 years after that, right? Last year, MRC released the report called Situation Report, talking about the severe change in Tole Sap already. So it's as what they predict, even though we only have 12 dams upstream in China and another 2 dams on the Mekong mainstream, in the lower Mekong mainstream. So I think gradually, something that MRC have been doing out of the criticism that they are not working with the people, but at least MRC have got some report from the data that they have, the hydrology data that they have, right? Back to 2018, MRC itself, the council study already said that if all the Mekong mainstream dam happen, about 97% of the sediment flow to the mouth of the Mekong River would be blocked by 2040. So actually all the information is there, it's kind of review came out more and more, right? And you see more that Cambodia and Vietnam also accept. Now they're talking openly that what happening in Tonle Sap and the Mekong Delta is because of the dam. No question, no more question now. It's pretty clear. MRC just released recently the concern statement about the Mekong drought and the color change as well, and that MRC statement have caused the criticism of China. I just saw in the paper that the Chinese academic who represent China, of course, saying that because MRC might listen too much to to the country outside of the region, so they released that statement, almost saying that shame on them, something like that, But I think maybe this is a sign of MRC starting to walk on the right track, maybe for the first time after so many years. So I think this fact is very clear, right? Cambodia, we're not talking about the loss of the local community along the Mekong or in Tonle Sap or in the Delta. We are talking about very much of the, part of the economic security of all these Mekong country. You might know that Cambodia used to depend 16% of their GDP with the fish, freshwater fish, and more than half of that came from Tonle Sap only. The Cambodian people eat more than 60 kilograms per person of fish each year. So nothing can replace the fish that now gradually gone. Sadly, now Tonle Sap and Mekong Delta became the true area of the most resettlement migration in the country already. And back to our country, Thailand, I think the change that we have seen majorly last year, for the first time in the history, the Thai government announced, accept the fact that we have 40% of the energy reserve margin in this country. But if you look exactly to January this year, our installed capacity is 45,467 megawatts. But our peak demand is only 25,686 megawatts, which means yes, we have 56%, over for our reserve margin. And what we are doing with this more reserve margin, we pay for it. It's in our electricity bill. So I am talking about the fact that happening, but at the same time, unfortunately, along with this fact, the dream and the rhetoric still ongoing, right? At least from our three country friends and our own country. China, keep ranting, right, about the upstream dam is helping us downstream by releasing water during the dry season, so you will not lack of water. China can only say this nonsense thing because us, the lower Mekong country, allow China to do. Thailand, with this much reserve margin, keep saying that we are going to have the half of the energy in this region, so no worry. And they just announced that they're going to stop using the standard 15% reserve margin as our standard because they want to avoid the argument of we have too much reserve margin. And Laos, after 78 dams, they are very deep in debt. They have 1.2 billion US dollar debt, and they have the money in the pocket, only 800 million US from what I understand. And their latest struggle is to get more money from China. The biggest, the one who loaned them money. They just 3 days ago, there was just the news that the electricity, the Laos and the China grid company going to work together to control the whole grid system in Laos. Another bunch of the loan. And until now, after almost 100 dams, Laos do not pull themselves up from being the poor country yet. All right, so or whatever what you call rhetoric, who are going to make that better? I guess it has to be us, the public, right? And of course, as already mentioned by our friend here, and the people of the Mekong. Just 3 days ago, the Thai community from 7 provinces in northeastern Thailand came to Bangkok, and they demand, apart from demand the Thai government to stop buying electricity from Laos and help their livelihood, and they proposed that the government should set up the fund from the Mekong killing project benefit. The people who invest have to put the money in. And they also proposed the Thai government need to talk to Laos and China immediately about the dam. So I think both the people from the northern and northeastern Thailand, they have been more progressed than the government. This is clear, right? They already proposed, the northern people already talked to the Chinese company publicly for some time ago, and the government need to catch up with them on this. I don't want to repeat what Carl already talked about the data sharing, the US, China, but I think we should not forget that there is a history about the Mekong Dam, right? Of course, the first round of the plan of the Mekong Dam that ongoing now was heavily involved and written by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. We have no idea when China started building that dam. They never tell us, but they was sitting in the Mekong River Commission since the very beginning to observe what's happening. So I guess in the past 30 years, most of the data is in the hand of this power or the mechanism that we have our own government sitting in. But it never released to our hand, and those data never been used to help protect the Mekong. So the situation arrived today that you can see Mekong become blue and dry. So I cannot see anyone playing the role of hero now. And I think whatever happened, the Mekong region should not be only the benefit or the political playground of anyone, but it's supposed to be the place that people can use, the experience, the data, and the fact that we are facing now to negotiate. And I hope that nothing will be interfered. And attached with my last point here is that the actor that not showing their face yet, including our commercial bank, our energy authority, our fellow IFI, World Bank, ADB, who have been joining the troop to build the dam, have to come out with the idea as well. And I think, of course, this is probably the last round that people that have the sense and knowledge about what's happening to Mekong have to work together. And probably this chance is our probably last chance to help together to protect the river. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you go to the last but not least speaker, Ms. Laure, about the importance of involving the public.
So I'm a freelance journalist based in Bangkok for 7 years, and I cover mostly environmental issues in Southeast and South Asia for French and English language media. So I want to tell you a small story in 3 chapters and I will talk about 3 experiences of close reporting in the Mekong. So the first time I went close was in Laos in 2017 in February. So I went there by the road from Vientiane to Chulalongkorn to see how it is by the road, because it was a time where the highways, the train line and the dams were built at the same time. It was all starting at the moment with Chinese money, but we know that there was French, Korean and Thai companies for 10, 15 years ago also in Laos, but this time was a big surge of Chinese money, and you could really see it. There were cement factories, there was malls, there was big business everywhere in the middle of rural Laos. So I went there to try to talk about the consequences of this Laos being one of the first country in the Belt and Road project. And what's interesting is that no one wants to talk to you openly. No Laotian people, no French people, no Vietnamese people, no Chinese. It's not a language issue. Nobody wants to talk to you about the details of what is being done at the moment openly. So what I'm saying is that if you hang on long enough on the ground, you will always find people who will tell you what is happening, but always under condition of anonymity. And this is a big problem because you are jumping, basically you are walking from village to village to try to gather data and information about what just happened to people. So suddenly you stumble on a new village, like an American suburb. Suddenly you have a new village, all the houses are the same, in the middle of Laos. And you say, what is this? It absolutely doesn't seem like a village. So this is one of the resettlement villages. So when a dam is built, hundreds, sometimes thousands, people are moved, the houses are destroyed, and then we choose for them a place to put them again. So we build them houses, and the problem is that there is no consultation, mostly, I'm saying most of the time, there is no consultation about what is happening to them. So they talk to you, always under anonymity, but they tell you, okay, we have been moved this day, how many villages, how much did we get for the land that we lost, and in most cases it's always very low considering of what people could make of it. So you have this very bizarre situation where you have a great deal of anger and resentment, but people won't talk openly to you, and I'm just reminding why. You might all know that in Laos the civil society is very endangered, and Laotian activists or journalists will be arrested. Some have disappeared, and as foreign journalists you can be arrested or expelled, and you just kind of feel after a point that you have stuck long enough, you have made all your interviews, and you have to get out before being notified too long. So that was the case in Laos. The circulation of information was not there. No, minister will not even pick up the phone, yet there is no one to talk to you officially. No one is accountable, no one is responsible. You have to go village by village to do your own data collection. I want to tell you about the second chapter, which is Vietnam. So you mentioned the Mekong Delta. So in July 2018, I went there with a colleague to do a documentary about the Mekong Delta. So it has been mentioned there was a very severe drought that had a lot of bad consequences, but it took a while to really grasp what it was about. So you might know that as a foreign TV, if you want to do TV as a foreign journalist in Vietnam, you have to ask the authorization to the Minister of Information at least a month before, and then you have to hire an official translator. So that means somebody from the minister will follow you, from the Minister of Vietnam Communist Party, we will follow you everywhere in all your interviews. And it will not translate. You still have to pay for another translator who does the job. So it's this framework which is extremely heavy. And if you don't go in this visa that you have to do it very solidly, nobody will talk to you in the universities because academics won't talk to a journalist who has not been stamped by the Minister of Information. So you just have no choice. You have to go in the system, and when you are in the system, you have to find a way to still be able to get what you want from people. So I'm just telling you this so you have an idea of you arrive in a village with your academic friend to take you there, and people have been notified by your arrival, so there will be 5 men on a motorbike waiting for you in front of the house. So this is police in plain clothes, and you really have to be very careful of what you ask, of how, but at the same time you have only one chance. In 15 days you have to get everything you can in this situation. So I want to talk mostly about one expert there that my colleagues might know too. It's Daoroung Van Nie. He's a child survivor from the American war in Vietnam, and by sheer determination, he became one of the best environmental university professors in the south of Vietnam. So he spent 2/3 of his time going around village, and each day he meets 4 or 5 family, and he does this. I discovered this with him. It's this 1 by 1 family follow-up over 3 decades. So for 3 decades, you go to the same village, to the same family, and he takes notes in notebooks. So he has an immense collection, but it only exists there, the collection of notebooks of this man. And he was able to walk around the system in the sense of he would tell me everything and said you write it in your own words when you are out. And we would walk on the police was behind, but it's always polite. You're not sitting on your shoulder, but almost. So you have to walk a bit quick on the beach. There is a little wind so they don't hear, so you can finally have a conversation. And it was the same, the lack of official data. Nobody wanted to give you official data. Ministers would answer, but they wanted to be paid in Vietnam. So this is not something we do, and it was not in the budget. Yeah. I just want to tell a last thing about him, is that I followed him because he invented a small plastic needle, let me see, what did you syringe, yeah. Syringe, and with this, it's $4, and he gave it to every family in Vietnam, and then you can actually measure the level of salt that's already on your rice field. So if you have this, you know if there is too much salt, so you won't put rice field in it. And if the level is below a certain way, you know that your rice will survive. So this is a really simple thing. So he gives this to people, and he gives them a phone, a really burn phone, $15 phone. So people measure the thing in the field, then they send an SMS to him, and then he has this huge Excel. So just to explain to you how villager can be empowered and be an active part of documenting what's happening to the environment, even under the most hard regime. So that was really interesting, and this is why you do all the process of going through this visa, because you have to get to these people, and there is no way you're gonna get this information without being on the ground. So with Daoroung Van Nie in Vietnam, he told me, I do not teach people science, I teach them to survive. So he was explaining that because of all the wars in Vietnam, people had actually no knowledge of, they were displaced everywhere in the country between north and south. So from generation, there was a different things that happened to Thailand, where you have the same family for 3-4 generations on the same plot of land. This was not the case in Vietnam. People have been displaced. The village they were in, it was for 20 or 30 years. And then they have no knowledge of the soil. And why they have no knowledge? Because there is no documentation, there is no archive. So there is nobody who is mapping all these things. If as you said, the data is monopolized by states who don't open it, and private companies, so people don't even know what's the soil around them. So this takes me to the third chapter. That last year we went with my colleague photographer in Isan because we wanted to, because it's this, you have this wall, you want to talk about the Mekong, what is happening with China and everything, but you just don't have it, the information, and foreign journalist is very down the list to be talked to. So we're like, why don't we look at a dam that was built 30 years ago in Isan, North Thailand, that nobody care about anymore? And the mostly is that this community, so it's the Moon River in Sisaket province, this community was one of the first to document themselves, everything that happened to them. So from the beginning, the people could see that something bad was going to happen. This big cement wall, it was a time in the 90s where there was no environmental impact assessment in Thailand that was forced. So there was nothing. Company just asked the government, can I do this? So as you said, the American army started this whole project in the 90s in North Thailand. So this is it. We talk about China for 10 years, but let's not forget this comes from the Vietnam War. This need for infrastructure in the region, so the American army had a huge impact in building because the bases needed water and electricity. So it started like this, and then the government themselves started investing. So in the 80s, 90s, Thailand built their own dam before anyone else, before China came on the Mekong, with the help of the World Bank. So in the 90s, the World Bank financed 14 dams in the north of Thailand. As I said, without impact assessment, and it had massive consequences on people. So from one season to another, they lost access to the wetlands, to the fish, to the weeds, to everything my colleague mentioned. But what they did from the beginning is that they were empowered at the time by what we call the Assembly of the Poor. So the Assembly of the Poor is a network in the early mid-90s in Thailand. All the communities in Thailand who had a problem with natural resources being taken away from them. So it could be mines, it could be hydro projects, it was highways, it was all this big development that came in the 90s and that had a lot of damage on the community. So all these people got together and they actually walked in Bangkok, they walked to Bangkok in 97 and they stayed for 100 days in front of Government House. So this was a big thing. The first time so many farmers came in Bangkok to talk peacefully about this, about who benefits for development, what's the cost of having full electricity in Bangkok, what's the cost for people in the countryside. So this Assembly of the Poor was a big model, and it really gave confidence to people to resist what was happening, and they took picture of every struggle, they occupied some sites, and they took notes. They took notes of from month to month which fish is disappearing, where the water is now, why this weed is not there, after how many years will a tree rot in a lake, all these things that are not public data and that were not even done. So when we arrived there, there is a community center next to the dam, and there was cardboards full of old negatives and pictures that nobody ever looked at. And they were telling us, oh, it's here, but obviously we don't have resource to do anything with it. And it was amazing. It was the first picture we saw from the Assembly of the Poor for this big moment in Thai history that were taken by the people themselves. It was not media. It was one people in one village had a camera, and every little village struggle was documented. And so we asked for a grant, and we bought a scanner to digitalize all this picture. So the people did it themselves. We just let the scanner there, and in 2 months they scanned 2,000 pictures. And from there we picked, and now we are building an archive of struggle of communities in Thailand who fought for the natural resources. So the scanner is traveling around Thailand in communities who suddenly had, we have this too. So I'm trying to make a point that as journalists, you might know that media freedom in the region is attacked, but has never been that great. It has always been difficult. From the 70s it was worse, so I guess there is always worse in this period. But mostly we can't be anywhere, so what we are trying to do is to, and some communities understood it before everyone, that you have to, that knowledge is power. If you record everything, there is an evidence that this happened. And no company could tell you 20 years after that it didn't happen this way. Because if you have yourself the evidence that it happened this way, visual and in information, you have a case. And finally, you can have people who have a voice, is what is done and how the development is led in the region. So I think that for me the most, conclusion. So where I want to come is that an alliance, some sort of an alliance between journalists, between academics, and between residents, people in the village who are trained, who are given the support and who are given the resources to write their own history, is the way to finally impose, I would say, a dialogue to companies who are forced more and more to do impact assessment, but as Rosalia asked, the results need to be seen. So on government and companies, I think this alliance is necessary to impose a dialogue that has to happen. So finally people can tell their own story. And this is a way also for us to feel less hopeless or powerless, because you write your story in French, English, German, you put it out, and then what? And it's like if people can own their own stories and create a network, I think it will be very powerful for the dialogue. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I think this is exactly what the exhibition, these are the story collectors, some of the story. I think it's good to reflect on what has been said. They were done in the 90s, then they were stopped. They were considered so negative that the World Bank was no longer financing dams. Then they were reintroduced with the excuse that they were green energy. So this is why we have seen so many dams again since 10 years ago, as they were presented as a more sustainable, environmental friendly source of energy. So that makes us think about the way messages are framed and reframed for different objectives. But the question now is how to stop the dam and how to make people recognize that they are not as green and friendly as some like to present. So I open the floor for reflection, question, and other. Okay, I will take 3 questions first. So please, your hands. We have one here. Any other? Okay, 2. Okay, please.
Thank you very much. You've raised so many issues, and it's hard to, decide where to begin. But I wanted to say, Oh, I'm Marcia Brewster. I used to work at the UN here in Bangkok at SCAP in the Water Resources Branch. I was just thinking about the various comments about data sharing and the principles, the UN principles, the IFC principles, and the ADB principles, and I was wondering whether there are principles and restrictions on low flow, so environmental flow, minimum amount for drinking water, minimum amount for the environment. And if there are such restrictions and if there are such principles, how do you get the release from the reservoirs if this dam is preventing the minimum flow that would be needed for the environment for human beings?
Marcia, it's wonderful to see you again. It's been a long time.
Jim Stent, excellent presentations. I have two comments on Tony's presentation. Excellent presentation. You're doing admirable work. I wish you success, but I suspect you're up against some pretty powerful adversaries. And so I have two comments to offer. The principles you've outlined of all these various institutions all sound very good, but I've had experience with IFC. I've served on the boards of two banks, one in Myanmar and one in Mongolia, in which IFC had a major stake. And they had wonderful corporate governance principles, which they supported fully until they went against their own financial interests, in which case they were excellent at rationalizing why they wouldn't follow them anymore, sort of like our moderator suggested. Dams could now be built can be rationalized as green energy. So one has to, I think, be a bit skeptical about all these high-sounding principles that are put out. Second point is that it's a question, really. Even if these institutions can tick all the boxes in your audits, they follow all the process steps, is it not possible that the dam still shouldn't be built because it would result in silting problems that have been mentioned, fish disappearing, all kinds of things, yet it passed all the process examination? Thank you.
So I will start with Anthony first, and then go to the other speakers.
Yeah, and Carl can add about the environmental flow, but Marcia's absolutely right that in most cases the dams are required by their concession agreements with the Lao government in this case, or the Myanmar government, or the Cambodian government, that they have to have a certain amount of water flowing out of the dam to maintain what they call environmental flow. So that in the wet season, if the water has usually been at a certain level, then in the wet season, they have to maintain that level. In the dry season, if the water was down to a certain point, then they had to maintain at least that water flow in there. When I audit projects, I make sure that that is in every single stream and river and creek and whatever it is, everyone has environmental flow. And if they don't have it, Lao is my second language, so I speak Lao to the villagers, and they tell me, we're not getting water. We can't row our boats. We need to take fertilizer up to our rice fields, but we can't because the water is not deep enough. That means to me that there's not environmental flow. And some of my dams that I'm following up on, I actually receive a daily hydro report at how much environmental flow they're letting out of a re-regulation dam, so that I can monitor myself from Bangkok how much water is being released. And I know how much it says in the concession agreement that they have to release and whether or not they're doing it. So environmental flow, Carl may want to add something on that. In terms of the IFC, in most cases, on the projects that I work for, the IFC was only involved in one, actually, and I didn't care what they said. I would go by the concession agreement and by their IFC principles, or their performance standards, and I would monitor those and audit those whenever I went to visit the project, which is why they didn't like me. And then finally, the decision on whether or not a dam is built is actually based upon a feasibility study, so it comes a long time before people like me show up to begin auditing actual implementation, the construction of the dam, and then eventually the operation of the dam. So the feasibility study is part of that. The other is, of course, is the environmental impacts assessment on the large hydropower projects, and the initial environmental examination on the smaller sort of projects. Do you want to say something about that?
Thank you. Actually, I'll take the questions the other way around. I wanted to follow up on Anthony's point about safeguards being quite downstream. I mean, in the decision-making process, I think this is really important. Like many of the standards that have been discussed, assume a project is already going ahead, but the biggest, most important question is it needed in the first place? And I think this really answers to your comment about the rationalization of projects, like why is it needed in the first place? So I think, at least now, it's widely recognized that other forms of energy, like solar power, can compete with coal, it can compete with hydro, if the policy environment was allow it to happen. But at the moment, there's still rationalizations that they are not considered to be secure enough in terms of electricity, for example, to meet the base load supply. There are some rationalizations, but I think this is really important to recognize. It's the decisions upstream that really need to be discussed, like the overall rationality of why does Thailand need 50% reserve margin? And it's, again, with the rationalizations, it's becoming interesting because normally the reasoning is that new projects are built to meet anticipated future demand. But with such high reserve margins, it's just not possible to maintain that anymore. So now the narrative has changed to we need to create new demand to deal with the supply that we have, which include more investment in agribusiness and exporting to Malaysia and to the ASEAN power grid. So I think we need to pay attention to the politics of the rationalization, really important. Then for the first question on the e-flows, so I mean, there is scientific assessments, like IUCN has done a lot of work, for example, on e-flows, I think some would be aware of. But I think it also relates to whether water is actually available or not to be released. And I think we then have to look again, well, it would be nice to look at the concession agreements, but not many of them are in the public domain, or at least the complete versions. And primarily these projects, to be economically feasible, have to be operated in a way to maximize electricity generation. So what that means is when rainfalls first come, try and store as much water as possible. And then, once it's secure, then water can be released for other purposes. But primarily the projects are commercial operations to maximize electricity sales. So there's not, I think there needs to be a broader discussion reflecting what's been discussed recently, including in the context of China's upstream dams, about revisiting those types of contracts and saying, well, okay, like if floods and droughts have to be dealt with, and if this dam is here, then okay, how does it need to be reoperationalized to not just prioritize electricity generation? So, and again, this is partly speculative, I would say, because the information is not in the public domain about the way in which dams immediately store water. But I think the Mekong Dams Monitor will help a little bit with this because it will make more transparent how reservoirs are being operated, especially immediately after droughts have occurred and then rainfall starts to come. Are reservoirs holding water back, or are they prioritizing basic human and ecosystem needs? Or is it primarily to save water for electricity for the next dry season?
I think it is very difficult to come back to talk on the term like environmental flows and things. I think, of course, to us, in front of us is complete failure, right, of all the dams. Most of the dam in the Mekong is a runoff river. It used the Mekong itself as a reservoir. And until now, I still cannot understand why they decide 12 dams for the lower Mekong. Already 2 dams is already dead, right? The lower Mekong. The China or carry on 12 dams only because they built it before. So I don't think we are in the time to come back to discuss something impossible, right? I mean the lesson of Jinhong, the early this year when they released less water, already almost killed all the people downstream already, Sayaburi, and this Mekong blue and dry. So I think we have to talk about other things. I think we have to start talking about, what exactly the myth, why the myth of the dam still ongoing, right? I mean, the hydrology issues that being debated between, the monitoring team and the China, right? China still say now is what they release and store in the dam upstream is not more than what the natural Mekong have. So the debate between who have more water, what the upstream, downstream water and which season is still unclear. This is incredible, right? Because we also have MRC as well, who have the data all the time in the past 20 years. How come the hydrology information or the debate cannot be ended with what's really happening now? This is my own question as well. And then we can all say that what's really exactly happening. Because we have heard 10 years ago, if China store all the water in their reservoir and release at the same time, they can make the level of the Mekong in Cambodia raise about 12 meters immediately, something like that. So we have to have this data in order to really fix the problem if we really want to do.
Okay, I give a final.
Premrudee, you mentioned before we began the session that the change of characters. Okay, she talked about the change of the actual owners of these dams, and you've just spent a few minutes now emphasizing that it's the Chinese that are controlling the water. And that's in fact on the Mekong, on the tributaries of the Mekong, many of the early dams were Western investors who opened themselves up to IFC and World Bank and Asian Development Bank. The current investors, the current people building the dams are not the World Bank and the ADB and IFC or the Norwegians or the Japanese or the Koreans or anyone like that at all. It's almost all Chinese. So there has been, and you pointed this out, that there has been a big change in characters. Right? And for example, the Nam U dams, there's 7, the cascade of the Nam U, 7 dams all built by the Chinese. And many, many of the others as well.
1 minute, Tony. In terms of the owner of the dam, in the energy trade world, you can never say who owns the dam. It's going to change all the time, In one dam, like Nam Turn 2, there are so many times that you change, right? Also the owner, you have to link that into the energy market before we talking about who really owns it.
Yes, I think even in the dam in China there are foreign investors, so it's always good to look at the money flows beyond the country. It's not necessarily China or Thailand or Vietnam, but who are the investors behind? Okay, we have some question. 1, is anyone also for a last round? Okay, Ella, 2, 3. Okay, so please keep it brief, introduce yourself, and then for a final reply. Yes.
Okay, my name is Laure. I'm the Chief of Planning for the USAID Mekong for the Future. I've been talking about the projects of the US government so far. I'm afraid I'm the new one and add to that equation. So this is a new project, so I have been hearing your thoughts, sharing the sessions, so we congratulate the organizer. What I have been hearing is something what we have been discussing, that this is a new project that we want to help strengthening civil society capacities and equipping civil society with data competencies. And the U.S. government funded many projects on data, and we have been hearing that civil society need to use data, so I'm trying to bridge those gaps. And also, we have projects in 5 countries: Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. So I think what I'm interested to hear maybe from the panelists is it's good to raise awareness, it's good to talk about the problem, but maybe you will be able to share some of your wisdom on how we might be able to solve the problem through working with civil societies is one of the root cause of the problems that we identify, but maybe there are other ways that then we would be able to practically, strategically solve the problems in more years. Thank you.
Ella?
Thank you. My name is Zola. I'm from Junction. And I would like to continue about the news that I read that the community coming to government proposing the funding mechanisms to help the impacted communities, where they propose sin tax instead of social corporate responsibility, but this sin tax is put into the hosting country instead of the corporate. So I'm curious how such funding mechanism could come into reality, and if there's indicator about the funding feasibility in the social safeguard indicator assessment. Thank you.
Besides with the Junction, she's a master's student at Chulalongkorn in environmental management. Okay, Kim?
Thank you. I'm Kim Atkinson, a freelance writer now, but formerly in the United Nations editor. It just seems to me as a fairly much an outsider to the actual mechanisms and operations going on here, that there's a great mixture of drives or of motives, let's say, which are driving the activity of dam building, and forces, I would say, the financial flows and what's pushing the finances, and then the political ambitions of those who are controlling the finances. But there doesn't seem to be an overview of all this. I think it would be very useful if somebody would sort of present the choreography of what's going on here. And I don't think it's impossible at all, but it would need a collection of people like you who have observed so much. And once we have an understanding of the forces, then we could approach, we could make up a game plan of what really we should be doing. And that brings into play the people who are impacted by this. There's no real element of the people that are represented here. Governments say they represent people, but they are not at all representing. The people themselves are not articulating or being given what we know that they are saying that they want and what we think they really think they should have. So at the other end, the people then, once we know what the flows are, the forces and the driving forces are, we could then say, well, what should the people do to counter these forces? Should there be, like it's happening in Myanmar now, should there be a government in exile? Should there be civil disobedience? Should 60 million people just do something which would paralyze these forces which are inimical to them and the environment?
Before you go on to propose a revolution, I think I want to give very short time to all the speakers to please your final remarks, taking into account the questions that have been posed. Starting from the lady first this time, Prem.
Maybe shortly and also answer all the 3 questions. Not answer, but I think it's related to maybe the points of the so-called the people, the community, which we are not representing. And I'm not sure if we have all the same ideas, right? The question about the sin protect the sin fund. Yeah. But I mean, one thing that we noticed as a civil society group is that the local community also have their own step developing through their own experiences that they are facing on the hydropower dam. They have their own strategy, and I think what, as I mentioned, what they're trying to do is not only complain, but they're trying to negotiate in their own way. They try to say some, what you call propose something, right, to the Thai government. And this is back to the Premrudee Dam, more than 20 years ago. Until now, you can see all these, ways that they are walking. And I think we have to observe that together. But what I have to mention here is that I'm a little bit concerned, because when we are talking about the support in the area of the political what you call fighting, whatever. I mean, we are seeing lots of money flowing in by our rich friends from east side, right? From the funding from China and also from the US in a sense. And I'm just wondering, this is my question as well, right? If this is going to impact or distract the way the people develop their own strategy, fighting with the dam. Frankly speaking, maybe even the money that comes from the goodwill can really impact the people as well. Too much money, too quick money. But from what I have heard, not so many conditions. It's a lot of money with very little condition. So I think, to me, I always make this note to the people. I hope it will not distract or split them in the worst case. Thank you.
I'll start with the big challenging question of the choreography of the region. I think if I could summarize it in literally a few words, it would be the shift from public to private interest. I think that's the essence of it. And I mean, the answer probably lies ultimately in the political economy of the construction industry and the energy industry. But I think the bigger picture is the changing policies and the concept of public good versus private gain and interest. I actually want to pick up more on what next, because I think with the provisos that Ian has actually mentioned about movements coming from genuine causes, like reflecting people's genuine interests, I think transparency is really important, and both the data that's been released by the MRC from China and the Mekong Dams Monitor is aiding that transparency. But now, as I mentioned in the early intervention, it has to go beyond it. I think something civil society is important civil society to do is to document and be able to have channels of communication. I think things have to not be just discussed as problems, but solutions that really meet people's needs. I think what's missing, perhaps, is an open, unconstrained discussion about the future. This may sound a bit too soft, but I think a genuine discussion about visions of what the future could or should be and how to get there is something that doesn't happen much or enough, apart from when it's into invited processes that already have agendas or that constrain the discussion into water management or something like that. So I think nowadays, I know that UNESCO, for example, talks more about these futures literacy and future studies, and I think there's a lot of tools nowadays to talk about what the world could be, and that's the first step on how to get there. I think the last thing is maybe something more directly and probably tricky for the US. I don't think that any solution could be without China, honestly speaking. Like, a rules-based regime has to emerge. There has to be a role for states, a state that's accountable. But ultimately, it has to involve all the countries that are along the river. But I don't want to overemphasize the role of the states, because I think what the civil society movements have been doing are really important as a different visioning of the future. But if China is marginalized, I think pressure works to a degree, as we've seen. But I think a long-term solution can't just be dependent on the stick. It has to be more than that. Thank you.
Maybe if I can add to this point, I was with the Rockefeller Foundation before. At the time, we funded the starting of Mpower, Mekong Power, that was a network of various organizations in the Mekong, but it included a lot of organizations from Yunnan. So I want to say that collaboration with China, especially at the level of civil society, is possible and should be. I don't know what's happened to Mpower now. I think it's still alive, but I don't know how active. But I think it was a very productive engagement at the time. I am talking about 2000 and of that. Okay, Tony?
On the role of civil society, we're dealing with governments along the Mekong who are very sensitive to civil society organizations. I'm trying to be diplomatic. They're very sensitive to civil society organizations. And as a result, they're not very welcome. And so I think you had the best solution, and that is get civil society through academics, perhaps, to train the villagers, to fend for themselves, to work as they are working in monitoring the sediment levels in their rice paddy fields, for example, and to begin to monitor the impacts of climate change and the impacts of the dams and the impacts of environmental flow. But turn it over to the villagers to do that. You have a lot of young people in the village now. Everyone has a smartphone. Everyone can be contacted through some sort of an app. And we're just not using the technology that we have available to us to talk to the villagers and to train them to use that technology. And that's a very important role for civil society. All right? So I think that can be done. But I call it the Vietnamese model. When I go out and meet with the villagers to follow up and do my audits, what I do is I give them my recommendations based upon several decades of work in Southeast Asia, and I call it giving them coping strategies to cope with the Chinese dams and to cope with the next dam that's going up. So it's called giving them coping strategies. The question of the funds in the concession agreements that I'm familiar with, the companies that are building the dams are obligated by their concession agreements to, in fact, establish community development funds at the village level, at the district level, sometimes at the village level. And sometimes it's done very well, other times it's done not so well, and there's a lot of corruption in some cases, but in other cases it's done very well. And so there are very good models, and I think that the journalists should go out there and find those models and to try to play them up and say, this is the model that's working, and this is the one that's helping the villagers to actually cope and give them some additional coping strategies. As to what's going on, Kim, no one knows. Carl knows better than anybody because he's following it and has made some very good presentations already on this. The U.S. is coming in and trying to figure out also what's going on and what's going to work and what's not going to work. Which is why when I go into a project area, I make a big point about doing a CIA, cumulative impact assessment, so that any dam that goes up has to know what other dam is already there. In most cases, that's not done, believe it or not. Nobody knows, Kim. So that if you're building a dam here, no one knows what the dams upstream are doing. And we've had dams break in Laos already, and you know this. And it's knocked out power plants, it's knocked out other dams, and what's to come in the future, we have no idea because we don't really know how strong these dams are built. So cumulative impacts assessments, I think, are very important to try to figure out what's going on, Kim.
To answer all the questions together from this point of view, as Carl said, the first thing as a solution is ask people the opinion from the beginning before you build it, and have a proper neutral impact assessment, which is not monopolized by companies' wording, if it's necessary, because I'm just going to give you 3 lines of the Rassi Salaidime. I'm talking to you from 30 years before Nissan. So we have a volunteer, because people know what it costs, people know if it fulfills their needs, and when it doesn't, they ask questions about why billions of euros were used for it. So I'm going to just tell you about in 1992, so this small dam on the river in the Moon River in the north of Thailand, most have never heard about it. So the construction cost 24 million euro, 5 times the initial budget that was announced, not including maintenance every year. So you add 10 million every year maintenance. The amount of compensation to be paid to the villager for the loss of the land is 55 million euro, half of which has still not been paid 30 years later. Okay, one dam. You have 14 on this river, just on the north of Thailand. Okay. All this, and the family still do not have enough water, because only a reservoir was built, and the pumping station were actually not built, and the canals, pumping station and canals that you can actually use to drag this water in times where you don't have water in the hills. This is the whole point of having the reservoir for dry season. But if you don't build a canal, it will just be a dead pond with no fish. So this is what people got. Wetlands that was fulfilling all their needs from a dead pond. You cannot say it differently. And this cost close to 100 million euro. And people still don't have water in Isan. And at one point you have to really look at I think the solution is look at it really from a local point of view, that you cannot have this big mega project imposed on big portion of land where things are different. Here you will have more salt, here you will have more. So you have to be really careful of what you do with this river, which is alive. So this, I wanted to give you one example, and to answer your question, why are we doing this dam? And it's power game. It's you have a nexus of people who make a lot of money from it. You have the bank who lend the money. You have the politician who say, okay, let's do this dam, and then you have the construction, and the construction is an immense pot of gold. It goes from the trucks to the cement. It's millions for a lot of people. But small people compared to the general interest. So at one point it's an oversight, and we can go bigger. At one point it's the big picture, it's politics. It's if people are not represented from the beginning, be it in election or be it what do we do with our village, there is no voice, and they will be just be imposed thing. And to answer to the question about is it good 20 years later to give cash to people? No, not really, no. It's better to give them land, or don't take the land for starter if you don't really need it. And this is a discussion in the civil society that has to do with democracy and representativity, and people in Isan will tell you that since the coup, they have no power of negotiation. And if you want a very concrete example of what politics does to local level, this is what it does. When you cannot vote, when you don't have the system they voted for again, they don't have a way to address this grievance, and this goes in any walks of life. Yeah, that's my answer.
So unfortunately I have to close, but I think the words from Laure are good enough for a conclusion. I want to add clearly we have to work at different level, talking in terms of the river. We have to work upstream and downstream. Upstream to address the causes and discuss whether dams are indeed needed to start with, whether electricity in such quantity is really needed or is just for trade purposes, etc., etc., etc. Deconstruct the old discourse, as well as more to ameliorate some of the impacts or reduce some of the negative impacts. I think there is a lot of expectation for civil society, but unfortunately, civil society has lost funding, has lost civil space. So we need to, if we are serious about civil society, then we need to again to start funding civil society. We need to give the political space to civil society to act. Otherwise, we cannot expect, I am afraid, that they will do to resolve all the problems that others have created. So I think this is a very important, because the shrinking place for civil society has become less and less financially, as well as in terms of political and economic space. So we need to rediscuss about the role of civil society in terms of how best to support, if we think that they are the most strategically placed to do something about all these social, environmental, and political problems. As it seems, we do believe, but then what are we doing to support civil society? And I will leave it at this for today. Please enjoy looking at, even if they are tragic, but still they talk to us about what people see as the story of the Mekong. As I say, they come from different countries, from different people with different background. You can also enjoy some food and no alcohol, but some water beyond this. So please continue the conversation. And please, some people will go around with a donation box. Do your duty to support civil society, including Junction. Thank you very much.